Washington State's soon-to-be governor, Bob Ferguson, he plans total resistance to the incoming Trump administration's very clearly stated plan to deport illegal aliens who are criminals, sex predators, drug cartel members, and who are involved in other criminal activity in Washington State. Now, it isn't completely clear why current AG and soon-to-be Governor Bob Ferguson, nicknamed Sideshow Bob by many observers, wants to actually stand in the metaphorical schoolhouse door like Democrat Governor George Wallace long before him, so long ago, back in 1963. But Democrat Ferguson, unlike Democrat Governor Wallace, is demanding that our state keep these criminals here in Washington State rather than send them back to where they came from before they decide to prey on the people of our state. And of course, register to vote, and probably collect state and federal subsidies along the way. But this appears now to be Ferguson's just well-reasoned, if not very rational, political stance. So let's explore the details and the likely impact of these policies on our state and the likelihood of success for Ferguson's plan to protect our most violent criminals and apparently invite more of them to our state. Now, before we get to this kind of insane and absurd political schemes of our new governor, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button down below if you haven't already done so. It costs you nothing but a few minutes of your time, and you can also share this video with others who might be interested in these topics about Washington State and other local issues. And let's get back now to what appears to be the inevitable Trump versus Ferguson food fight. Now, we all know it is basically no secret that Ferguson essentially defined himself as the anti-Trump while he was Washington State's Attorney General. And I get it. We all get it. From his perspective, he appeared to harvest more mail-in ballots than Trump actually received in Washington State in this election. But at what point does Ferguson jump the shark and then just look like kind of a crazed leftist loon? Well, maybe he doesn't look that way to Evergreen State college grads, the Seattle Times editorial board, or the elitists in the college faculty lounges in our state. But where else in Washington State would anyone think it should be the state's highest priority to collect the most violent sex predators, criminals, cartel members, and other violent criminals from all around the world, and then prevent them from being deported to the countries of origin if they're not American citizens or legally in our country? I mean, what kind of winning political plan is this? How is this good public policy? Now, outside the leftist swamps in which Ferguson slithers, people view him just a bit differently. And I mean, this is kind of the same governor candidate here who basically lied and pretended to care about public safety just a few weeks ago. Now, exactly as I predicted, he tosses those promises right out the window once election month is passed, and apparently Ferguson plans to recruit and keep as many violent criminals from around the world as he can actually import here and, of course, hand out taxpayer cash to keep them here and presumably get them registered to vote as an added bonus. Now, obviously, he is using Washington State's absurd sanctuary state policies passed so many years ago, which simply make it easier for illegal alien criminals to find sanctuary in our state. And in Ferguson's kind of weird, distorted anti-public safety world, this means protecting violent criminals and inviting them to prey on the people who live in our state. Oddly enough, the victims are disproportionately the ones who probably voted for Ferguson originally. So, once again, Ferguson defines himself as the protector of criminals and violent felons, while the rest of us can just do our best to protect ourselves and our families from these same criminals Ferguson appears to support so strongly. Now, a little aside here, this behavior by Bob Ferguson, future AG Nick Brown, and the other Democrats who have all kind of jumped on this pro-violent criminal bandwagon, this really should seriously invite major investigation at the federal level into possible ties between organized crime syndicates and Washington State's government agencies and the grant recipients and kind of our state's current political class. I mean, we've suspected now for many years that the international drug cartels are tightly tied into the homeless industrial complex policies, which often really defy reason, logic, or common sense, and which are never audited or verified because that would probably be racist, of course. In fact, just a few years ago, I produced this video right here, basically titled, "If Mexican Drug Cartels Ran Seattle, How Would Anything Be Any Different?" Now, I'll link to this video down below in the video description if you want to actually watch it. And seriously, if somebody really needs to explore these connections, which include financial and public policy aspects, which certainly, basically, they appear to be designed to facilitate maximum profit for the drug cartels in Washington state and elsewhere in many of these sanctuary state and city administrations. Now, our incoming Ferguson regime basically seems to be doubling down on their pro-crime, pro-cartel policies previously enacted and cemented in place during the recent Inslee regime. Now, Ferguson was recently quoted in various media publications as being a bit more concerned that the Trump administration won't be such an easy pushover this time around. I mean, last time he bragged about his 99 lawsuits against Trump. Well, Ferguson was state attorney general. Now, Sideshow Bob put out press releases every other day about it during his time, and he really only failed to put out press releases when he would lose those same cases. But now he's concerned that it will be less easy to sucker a gullible public into believing that Bob is basically doing anything except grandstanding, even if he must convince his former employee and former U.S. Attorney Nick Brown here, basically, who will be taking over the reins of the Washington State Attorney General's office, to carry Ferguson's political water for him. Now, this really does seem like a bad rerun for a boring movie that we never really liked the first time that we saw it. But the bigger question will be how the feds approach Washington state's open hostility to the rule of law, the Constitution, common sense, and basically norms of governance in a politically divided world. And here's where we get to an unknown future, and the impact is a bit more unpredictable. But let's review these potential scenarios because I believe that it's possible we may see some or all of these come to pass if the Trump administration is truly serious about deporting illegal alien criminals first as their priority. Now, Trump's nominee for ICE, which stands for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, is Tom Homan here, who has already gone on the record to warn the handful of states and cities weirdly resistant to deporting violent illegal alien criminals. Explicitly, he has stated that people, including government officials, who are guilty of illegally protecting and harboring these violent fugitives would be subject to legal action and possible arrest. Now, could he actually do this? And I suspect the incoming administration is probably drafting up contingency plans for exactly this scenario, but I'm not sure Washington state will actually be the test case for this type of event. In fact, it could be Colorado here, specifically the weird and embarrassing mayor of Denver, and maybe it's going to be Michigan or Illinois, Massachusetts, or even California. Now, Ferguson, on the other hand, he's got many political faces, many of which we know, and we can't be sure which one he's going to wear next year. One aspect of his proposed policy really clearly not appreciated by the goofballs in places like Washington state is how these absurd efforts to protect violent criminals will only invite more of them to flock here and flock right to our state, even if it's just a temporary surge out of the more cooperative states who are happy to send their criminals and violent sex predators back to their home countries. Now, perhaps federal law enforcement would use this internal migration of criminals to concentrate the large deportation efforts from sanctuary states into big confrontational events. I don't know. We won't know for sure right now. But Ferguson is inviting this exact type of fiasco in Washington, and he's planning to do that right now. So Democrat Bob Ferguson clearly has no concern about how many innocent victims that he creates with his policies, and this should be no surprise. He never has before, and really, why would he change? Now, secondly, the pre-inauguration open hostility combined with Ferguson's kind of historic frenzy of insurrectionist behavior seems likely to encourage a more impressive Trump administration response in Washington state than in other less confrontational jurisdictions. This might include the appointment of more aggressive U.S. attorneys to Washington state and overruling any blue slip rejection notices from the Democrat senators in D.C. Historically, the federal Senate has actually accepted the prerogative of local senators to use negative blue slips or no slips to basically blacklist capable U.S. attorneys or federal judge appointments to their state. And that's been a kind of their prerogative. But there is a precedent to overrule this. And Ferguson, among other kind of crazed leftists around the country, they may actually help encourage this break in the arcane Senate tradition they've had for so long. Now, I'd point out that as Governor Inslee retires and gets to collect the payoffs promised to him by some of the Climate Commitment Act recipients, Ferguson's just no longer here in Inslee's weak shadow. So the more unhinged and kind of weird Ferguson becomes, this will help draw more attention from the Trump administration right here to Washington State. And it's not because we're the center of the universe as much as we might want to be, or even the most important fight in the country, but just because Trump clearly is willing to have a confrontation and probably has an axe to grind with the lunar elements of our political class in Washington State right now. Of course, this may include a substantial diversion or a freeze on federal funds to our beautiful state. This will probably include federal grants that vanish and many other transfer payments that no longer come to Washington State during a confrontation. And while I would argue that Washington State is better off without these federal funds in most cases, it is certain that the grifters in our state who thrive on diverting these funds into their own pockets, they're going to be less happy with this type of outcome. Now, a coordinated public integrity investigation operation here in Washington State that would be conducted by the feds would really likely produce very significant results considering the substantial lack of historic investigation in the past and the political custom in Washington State by both State Attorney General's office and, of course, the state auditor to conveniently always look the other way and avoid any serious public integrity investigations. There are many corruption scandals lurking right below the facade of a calm exterior in Washington state government's operations that would actually be blown wide open, I believe, if the feds were to use their resources to properly investigate them. Now, in some of these cases, Bob Ferguson has essentially just ignored the corruption or actively covered it up during his 12-year tenure as AG. Regardless of how they basically sailed by the former champion chess player himself, Ferguson won't be able to pretend that these unfolding scandals didn't happen right on his watch. Now, how many political allies and friends will he need to throw under the bus in an effort to pretend that he has clean hands? Now, that bus could actually have a bumpy ride for the next 4 years in our state. Additionally, this Act Blue FEC money laundering scandal that's actually going on at a national level could become a much bigger story next year as this gets investigated really for the first time in our history. And some of this blowback is absolutely going to land in Washington State and the political beneficiaries of these campaign finance laundering operations as well. So how can we actually predict what the outcome from this inevitable chaos would be? In truth, we can't. But the politically powerful are probably grabbing as much of that cash as they can right now to better weather the coming political storm. And now, if the feds truly push some type of standardized federal election reform, which eliminates mail-in voting and restores citizenship and ID requirements, as I recently discussed in my video last week, how much will the political establishment in Washington State really start to panic? And will the Democrats continue to demand that Ferguson keeps protecting the illegal alien violent criminals in our backyard rather than address other pressing issues? Now, usually when it comes to a choice between protecting political power and then protecting some class of citizens that nobody really wants to protect, namely illegal alien violent criminals, I suspect that Ferguson's going to actually abandon his criminal friends. Now, you can usually predict politicians' behavior with a high degree of accuracy once you realize that their life basically revolves around the eternal quest for power, money, and control. And as these three legs of their stool are threatened and it gets wobbly, everything else is going to be abandoned just to keep their seat stable. Now, if a new U.S. attorney decides to pursue civil rights lawsuits against the Ferguson administration for obvious infringements on First Amendment rights with Ferguson's pet Ministry of Truth, maybe that kind of operation here, or the Second Amendment violations with some of our gun laws, which are clearly in conflict with federal rulings from the Supreme Court, it might become more interesting than people truly realize right now. Now, I can only see the proposal and basically the proposed federal AG, Pam Bondi right here, doing this if the Trump administration first appoints some aggressive U.S. attorneys willing to fight at a local level. And secondly, if the Trump administration decides to make Washington State a special pet project, which Ferguson just might be dumb and obnoxious enough to put himself in that category for the Trump administration. And if so, it might be part of this motivation for this type of litigation in our state. Now, if you want that type of outcome, you should just keep encouraging Ferguson to continue his shrill, unhinged campaign and its threats against the Trump administration next year. We really live in strange and eventful days, I truly believe, right now. There are a lot of national and even international issues that clearly have the potential to overshadow the conversations and the plans that we have right now, including the ones today. Now, some of these could make our petty, kind of local political fights appear to be very insignificant. Can we really avoid world war with a major military nuclear power like China or Russia before the inauguration? Can we avoid massive financial collapse caused by the bloated budget deficit, the national debt, and inflation? Regardless of administration coming in, any new federal administration must face this looming financial disaster head on, and really nobody will be happy with any solution that's proposed. Now, can our creaky power grid last long enough for us to fix it? Will we suffer another few years of public disorder caused by the insane left or Antifa or even foreign agitators in our nation? Will the deep state launch some new, fake, or even real pandemic or crisis in our nation or around the world in kind of a fit of rage after seeing their power decline? I mean, think COVID with just more credible body count. All of these scenarios and others that I haven't discussed or possibly even could imagine might be just around the corner right now as I speak and as we enjoy the Christmas holidays with our families and friends. That's not a pleasant thought. And yet you can't live your life in some type of analysis paralysis, too fearful to function or too paralyzed to be productive. You still get up, you go to work, you get your kids to school, you mow your lawn, you repair your roof, and you plan a holiday get-togethers. Time goes by regardless of the insanity of our political class. I spend most of my time investigating and exposing the corruption of government. And I do this not because I believe in some type of nirvana utopian event if we just vote in saints or get that perfectly crafted public policy. No, I actually do this because I believe that it's our civic duty to make sure government is reminded that they actually work for us. The fact that most of them clearly have forgotten. I also do this basically to ensure that we remind ourselves, our political class and our community, that it's actually we, the governed, that have and should have the final say. And I encourage and I help train others because we must engage and pay attention if we are to regain control over our out-of-control system that often appears to be falling apart all around us. Our success in restoring freedom and liberty will only come about if we can find teams of like-minded people to join us in this fight. We don't need huge numbers, but we do need dedicated people capable of grinding away and willing to speak truth to power, even to an abusive governor like Bob Ferguson. Most of us who care about freedom and liberty, we're well aware that we won't attain utopia on this earth, but we can fix some things that are broken. We can make it better. We can expose the truth, and we can organize with our neighbors and friends to fix what we find broken in government. However, it starts with being willing to show up. And that is essentially the first step, because the future belongs to those who show up.